Hey Shannon, so in this second video, I wanted to share with you the second big research finding that we've had in the new gathering that we just had this last week. And this is something that we call the five states of young adults. So you recall that we had a literature review and a survey, and then we did the interviews. But then what we also did is we began to do a latent profile analysis. We're really trying to go from here to here with our transitions, but then recognizing the fact that there are combinations of transitions that are happening that we were trying to capture. So the latent profile analysis is a person-centered statistical method. It really is trying to get underneath maybe the more surfacey findings that we have in our survey to try to see if there's some combinations with some of the questions that we asked that can maybe bring out some unique profiles or ways that there's commonality in the way that people answer the questions. And through this, we came up with this idea of five states. Now, why we call them the five states is probably important. We wanted to, in some ways, stay away from this idea of a profile, simply because nobody likes to be profiled. We also thought for a while about calling them personas, but the young adults that we shared this work with didn't feel comfortable about that either, because they would say that they move in and out of these states, that they sometimes take on more than one persona. So persona seemed almost too static for what we were getting at here. And so this idea of the state came along. Now, what's important about it is the states are really important, because sometimes I think what we have is, in a lot of ministry contexts, the assumption is that young adults are all the same. This is like everybody's the same. And therefore, the answer oftentimes, or the questions that leaders raise, are, what are we supposed to do about young adults? As though they're like this monolith, right? The other extreme is that we have some leaders that are like, young adults are so different that there's no way that we can do any programming for them. And so this is sort of their mindset. We believe that maybe there's something much more attainable, and that's what we came up with our five states. What this shows is the findings from our 1,044 sample size survey. And you'll see here that we've identified these different names, which I'll explain in a second. You have the focused networker, which made up about 40% of the sample, the supported optimists, which is about a third, the overwhelmed hopefuls, which is about 6%, the marginalized resilience, which is about 14%, and then the disoriented experimenters, which was about 12%. Now, we find that this is a really helpful graph as far as showing the findings, but it also could be problematic for some leaders, because I might look at this and go, wow, if this is the case, we can almost hit 70% of young adults by just focusing on the focused networkers and the supported optimists. We think that that's not necessarily the case, because these are states and young adults are moving in and out of this. We want to be really careful of how we use these percentages, even though that was reflected in our sample. So it's better to think about the five states as a model. That there's a good chance that a young adult fits in one of these particular states at different times, and this means that they have different needs, and they actually require something different from, in our case, churches. So again, just some things to remember that we reminded our leaders last week, that this five states model is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. These are not labels, but lenses to appreciate. It's not a diagnosis. Not one is better than another necessarily. And this is more of about appreciation, to understand where young adults are coming from. Obviously, these are not individuals. These are composites, of course. So obviously, there's going to be variation with any individual. These are not stages. One does not graduate from one to another. They're more states. And so this is the approach that we tried to take. So when we think about this idea of the overwhelmed hopefuls, we're going to start with that one. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details in this video. You can slow down and look at these, or you can look at the PDF of the slides that I've given you, but you can see the breakdown across the board of the overwhelmed hopefuls. They tend to be more women. You can see the breakdown of race and ethnicity here. And then as far as orientation, you can see about a third identify as LGBTQIA, as well. With regards to education, you see about a little over half have a high school diploma, about a quarter have a bachelor's degree. Community, a lot of them are in the suburbs. And interestingly, a very high percentage of them actually participated in church. And just want to remind you, we make the distinction between attendance and participation. So this isn't about how many people show up or a percentage that show up on Sunday morning. This is about how they access church in a number of different factors that we've explained in previous findings that we've shared before. What we did then is that we looked at each of these states and we were able to identify individuals that fit these particular states based on the research that we've done. And then what we did is we were able to, for many of them, we had these in-depth interviews that we did as well. So we were able then to not only take the answers from the survey, but also to take the qualitative data from our interviews to give a thicker description of what an overwhelmed, hopeful, or one of these states are actually going through. And so if there's anything that I would encourage you to do at this point is, and I'm not going to read these for you because you can do that on your own, but I would just sit with these vignettes. You remember the young adult vignette that we have presented to the young adult gatherings before. This looks particularly at each of the states, and we tried to capture some personhood behind these states and these descriptions. And so these are worth reading. We've spent a lot of time in them, and we really think that they reflect really where young adults are at. One thing to think about with an overwhelmed hopeful, though, if we could just summarize it, is this is an overwhelmed hopeful is probably experiencing all of the 7 transitions. These are ones that they are holding on to for a number of reasons. And a lot of times, a lot of expectation is placed on them from other people as well. So they are sort of at a tipping point when it comes to transitions in their lives. And so we asked the question, well, what kind of church do these young adults need? And they would probably say a church that supports us. Like, this would not be the person to ask them to volunteer to do something in your church. Like, they actually need some support and some way to take the weight off the pressure that they are feeling. The next state is what we call the focus networkers. As again, you can see here, the more identify as women. The race and ethnicity breakdown is pretty similar to the national breakdown. Predominantly straight. They have there's a higher percentage that have a bachelor's degree. You can see how they spread out community, and then their church participation is still pretty high, but not quite as high as the previous one that we talked about before. And so again, here's another vignette of a focused networker. And maybe the best way to capture them, and the metaphor that we used is probably this rock climber. A focused networker has a pretty laser focused vision as to what they want to do next. For them, transition is an obstacle that they are trying to work through to get to their goal, but their goal is pretty clear and pretty centered along the way. And so they look at relationships as people that can help them take that next step, whatever it might be. So what kind of church do these young adults need? They need a church that launches us. And that launch is not like failure to launch or I can't adult. It's more of like this idea, who's like helping me as a mentor, as an expert, as someone that can help me figure out how to take that next step in this vision that I have of where I am going. The third state we identified was the disoriented experimenters. You can see the split here with regards to gender. They tend to score a little higher with regards to being white. You can see that the breakdown of sexual orientation. You'll see here that education, most are do not have a secondary post-secondary education, but they have a high school diploma. Community breakdown, and then you can see that the disoriented experimenters are participating in church a lot less. Again, this would be a great vignette to read. You hear in this vignette the apprehension of perhaps going down one road and it doesn't end well. And so they have to double back and reinvest. And so there's an apprehension as to invest in the next thing because they may waste more time or more money or more energy. And so the metaphor that we had for the disoriented experimenters is this sense of a maze, where I'm trying to find my way through a maze and I keep hitting these dead ends, which forces me to double back and find another way that can oftentimes be discouraging and disorienting. And so they're just trying to keep trying to find their way. And so what kind of church do these young adults need? They need a church that grounds them. Some of our leaders last week talked about this idea of like an anchor or a compass, like helping them find true north. In everything else, where everything else is up in the air and they're feeling this sense of disorientation, they need a community that kind of helps them be able to plant their feet somewhere and at least begin to look in the right direction again. The other one is the supported optimists, the state. The supported optimist, you can see, is split fairly equally in gender. You definitely have, a pretty good distribution with race and ethnicity. They're predominantly straight. They are fairly educated. And their participation with church probably falls somewhere in the middle of the other states as well. And again, I think what you'd find as you read this vignette, and I encourage you to do it, is these supported optimists um, uh, see transition as an adventure. They have family support, oftentimes communal support. They don't see transition as getting in the way or a problem or overwhelming. They're like, wow, this is so exciting that I get to try new things. And so the metaphor that we have for this is this idea of adventure. And so you see the map here. Where are we going next? Which has a different feel associated with it than perhaps some of the other ones. So what kind of church do these young adults need? Well, I think a church that inspires us, they would say. Perhaps a lot of churches think about young adults in this realm, that the whole idea of young adult ministry is just to fire them up or get them together and inspire them and keep their attention. That's only one state out of the many states that we've described. And while that may be true for some emerging adults, it certainly isn't true for all of them. So and then we have the marginalized resilience. The marginalized resilience, you can see here, lean a little bit more toward women. You'll see here that there's a higher percentage of BIPOC and there's a higher percentage of LGBTQIA associated with that. You can see the breakdown of education, community, and church participation, of which church participation is pretty high compared to the other states. And so if we were to read this vignette, I think what you'd find is that there is this sense of marginalization. They've been misunderstood by family or their community, yet there is this sense of resilience associated with them, where they are looking to find their way and that they are actually, their voice is becoming stronger as they try to make connections and find a community that they can connect with. So the metaphor for this one is this idea of a refining fire, that sometimes it's a really, really tough spaces that they're put in as they're misunderstood and perhaps discriminated against. Yet their voice seems to be getting stronger, and that's really, really important to them. And so what kind of church do these young adults need? Well, they need a church that honors them, honors their story, sees it not as something that is endured or tolerated, but actually as part of the community's story as well. So if we were to summarize the 5 states, here you have the descriptions of each one. Also, the metaphor that describes how they see transition or experience transition, and perhaps ways that they're looking for communities like churches to actually support them in their particular states. What we learned from the research is that there isn't like one particular type of emerging adult that fits any one of these types. There is different race, gender, ethnicity, orientation in all of these. but they certainly have different combinations, obviously, as we saw from the data. So we think that there's something really significant here. We have the 7 transitions that are particular about identifying what the transitions are, but we're also discovering that the ways emerging adults experience transition has an effect on how they view transitions and also the ways that they're seeking support that churches can offer. So I hope that's helpful to you. And thanks for listening to this explanation.